Hello, my name is Roxy Kiernik and I'm the head of process development for mRNA and plasmid modalities at BIA Separations, a Sartorius company. Today I would like to take you through purification and analytical approaches to mRNA, but before we go there, we need to consider the structure of mature mRNA molecule. mRNA molecules used for therapeutic purposes vary in size from 1,000 to over 10,000 nucleotides and are composed primarily of three key components: a 5' cap, the gene of interest, and poly A tail at the 3' end. mRNA is synthesized from a DNA plasmid template in a reaction called in vitro transcription, where with the help of key enzymes and additives such as T7 polymerase, pyrophosphatase, and various other chemicals is produced in a cell-free environment. They co-synthesize with the RNA could be unwanted byproducts, and in the IVT reaction there is still residual template unless we remove it enzymatically. And so in the purification process we are separating mRNA in principle from the DNA template, the enzymes used for the synthesis, the building blocks or nucleotides or NTPs, capping and other reagents. But we may also have to remove any other process-related impurities coming from the actual process of producing the plasmid that is used as a template. Plasmids are typically produced in E. coli. Therefore, there may be residual proteins, residual DNA, and even residual RNA present from E. coli host cell organisms. There may be impurities coming from the raw materials such as enzymes or other reagents. There may be endotoxins still present from the E. coli host cell. And last but not least, there are product-related impurities, double-stranded RNA, truncated species, fragments, aggregates, and other potential impurities. So we need a robust and selective purification approach, as well as good analytics to understand the process and be able to achieve target purity of final mRNA drug substance. One thing that we have to bear in mind is that mRNA is in fact very large. It is much larger than traditional biopharmaceutical products such as IgGs. If an IgG molecule, a monoclonal antibody, is approximately 150,000 Daltons, a small mRNA molecule could easily be 3 times larger and is possibly 12 to 20 times larger than a standard IgG molecule. That has a consequence on its physicochemical characteristics, namely it has a very low diffusion coefficient, namely it diffuses very slowly in solution, and so traditional purification approaches, as we shall see later, are inadequate and may lead to low yielding purification processes, to damaged products, and as such we need to develop purification approaches that are suitable for the size and physicochemical properties of mRNA. Chromatography is one of the driving horses in purification of biopharmaceuticals, and as mentioned just a minute ago, the purification approach needs to be tailored to the size of molecule we are purifying. Traditional purification media, such as porous particles, in its core architecture are made of spheres with high porosity on the surface. But the pores, which were designed to bind very small molecules such as aspirin or middle range size proteins or even an IgG, are not suitable, are not large enough to actually bind a molecule of the size of mRNA. The pores are simply too small. Another factor is that porous particle binding depends on diffusion. And as we saw earlier, diffusion for a molecule size of mRNA is extremely slow. So taken together, purification of mRNA requires different chromatographic media. Chromatographic media with binding sites large enough to accommodate the size of mRNA, and also chromatographic media that does not depend on diffusion for mass transport, meaning for bringing the molecule to the binding site. And a chromatographic media that very amply satisfies these requirements are so-called monoliths. Monoliths being polymers with engineered flow channels with very precisely defined pore sizes, standardly 2 micrometers, which is significantly larger than a typical mRNA molecule. And the sides of these channels are modified with suitable ligands. And I shall speak more about the selection of ligands available for purification of mRNA. So that is the size of available binding site. And second is mass transport. So we do not want diffusion to play a role. And indeed, with monoliths, the mass transport depends on so-called convective mass transport, meaning we can carry the molecule to its binding site on the binding site of monolith simply with flow rate. There is no requirement for diffusion because there are no dead-end pores. So monoliths turn out to be very suitable purification tools for mRNA. And there are a number of ways, a number of chemistries, different ligands that we can immobilize on the sides of these of the channels running through the monolith to give us different tools, different handles on mRNA, so we can capture or polish mRNA using different approaches. Here I list those that are most standardly used. We can either use affinity purification, which relies on a very specific interaction between polyadenylation tail, which I mentioned at the beginning, installed on the mRNA molecule, and a corresponding oligo-deoxythymidine chain installed on the chromatographic surface of the monolith. So this achieves a very highly selective isolation of the RNA. But there are other approaches. We can use the fact that mRNA exhibits ionic properties, and hydrogen. It's got opportunities for hydrogen bonding to capture it with a ligand that is suitably designed for that. We can use the fact that mRNA can also behave as a hydrophobic molecule, and we apply either reverse phase or hydrophobic interaction chromatography. And we can do this both for purification approaches as well as for analytical. First, let's have a look at purification approaches. If the molecule of interest, namely mRNA, has a polyadenylation tail installed in its sequence, then we can make use of the affinity of poly A in short for its cognate base T. So A and T make the famous 2 hydrogen bonds, and so this gives us a very selective tool for purification of RNA. I show here a chromatogram of EGFP mRNA captured from in vitro transcription reaction mixture with a CIMmultus. This is a preparative line of monolith columns immobilized with oligo DT ligand. Flow-through contains everything that is not polyadenylated, and after a short wash we elute mRNA with 95% recovery in a very low molarity of tris buffer. This is a very simple purification approach with capacity of up to 3 milligrams per milliliter of resin that achieves, we can use high flow rates and achieve high recovery of polyadenylated mRNA. This is a very suitable tool. But not all mRNA constructs contain a poly tail, and so in such a case we can turn to anion exchange mixed with hydrogen bonding, so multimodal ligand called PrimaS to capture mRNA without poly tail, but the approach also works for poly containing mRNA. In this case we achieve more separation in the gradient, and in this case we're looking at a pH gradient from 7.5, pH 7.5 to pH 10, where most of the IVT components elute early. There's a degree of separation of proteinaceous species from nucleotides and capping reagent, followed by plasmid, which elutes as an individual peak, followed by elution of mRNA. And as we can see from the agarose gel on the right, we achieve very high selectivity for mRNA using this approach. We are not bound to a pH gradient approach here. We can also use pyrophosphate elution, which mimics the phosphate backbone interaction between the ligand immobilized on the column and the mRNA. So we've got various selectivities also possible in the purification. We can also use hydrophobic properties of mRNA if we apply the so-called hydrophobic interaction chromatography mode. In this mode we have to dilute the mRNA sample in high concentration of salt, such as sodium chloride, and as we bind the column to hydrophobic column in high molarity of salt, and here we talk about 2 molar salt or more, by the expulsion of water molecules, the mRNA binds to the with its hydrophobic surface to the hydrophobic surface of the column, and then as we decrease the salt concentration, the interactions weaken, and eventually the mRNA comes off the hydrophobic surface of the column, and this gives us selectivity between mRNA molecules of different hydrophobicities, and this can be shorter fragments, this can be residual DNA present in together with mRNA, and we demonstrate selectivity between single-stranded RNA and double-stranded RNA using this approach. And as we can see here, applying this polishing step in sequence after oligo DT purification, we can achieve very high purity of mRNA, in this case EGFP, which is approximately 1000 nucleotide long mRNA. And the final purification approach mentioned is so-called reverse phase chromatography, very well known in the biopharmaceutical sector for specifically for analytics, but in context of mRNA it achieves very high selectivity for individual sizes of single-stranded RNA. And so here we show separation of single-stranded RNA molecules ranging from below 500 nucleotides to over 6,000 nucleotides, and this purification approach takes place at elevated temperature and in presence of acetonitrile. So these were 4 different tools available for purification of mRNA, but we can use same ideas, same interactions also for analytical determination of purity or content of mRNA. We use 3 out of 4 of these tools, namely affinity, ion exchange mixed with hydrogen bonding, and reverse phase approaches for analytical work with RNA. So let's have a look. Let's start with anion exchange mixed mode with hydrogen bonding interaction. So the PrimaS column, which is exceedingly useful as an analytical tool, operated in pyrophosphate gradient. As mentioned earlier, this column chemistry achieves separation between mRNA and plasmid, as well as nucleotides and capping reagent, and does that under typical monolith chromatography conditions, namely high flow rates, so in which equates to a short analytical runtime. Here we look at a sub 3-minute separation gradient where we gather all of this information: concentration of RNA, concentration of plasmid, concentration of nucleotides, and here we resolve GTP from ATP from CTP, which coalutes with UTP, and we separate it from two completely different capping reagents, of which one is typically used. And responses on the UV detector are linear, and so you can imagine using this approach to follow the progress of IVT. For example, we can monitor for example, every 15 minutes the progress of our IVT reaction. On the right hand side we see how the mRNA peak increases while the NTPs decrease. We can use PrimaS for other purposes which rely on quantification of mRNA. For example, we can combine chromatography with the enzymatic digest. In this case, we combine it with exonuclease, which is selective for uncapped 5' uncapped mRNA. So if we apply exonuclease treatment prior to PrimaS chromatography, we digest all of uncapped mRNA molecules and leave behind only capped variants. And in this way, by comparing by comparing digested with undigested samples, we can determine the percent of 5' capping, and we do not require mass spectrometry for that. So it's a very useful tool. And changing focus a little bit from ion exchange to reverse phase, same as we've shown for prep in terms of separation by size, and as mentioned, separation between single strand and double strand. At analytical level, we can use reverse phase chromatography to separate between a single-stranded RNA from larger or smaller fragments, which typically come in double-stranded nature. So here we show a spiked sample of non-single-stranded RNA, namely double-stranded RNA, as demonstrated by this dot plot, which was recorded for every minute of elution from single-stranded RNA. And finally, I would like to tie all this information together, so how we prep the RNA, how we analyze it, into a case study that looks at the quality of the product from the perspective of thermal stability. We have applied affinity purification with CIMmultus oligo DT column on a standard mRNA 1000 nucleotide long, and we compared it to a traditional purification approach, namely precipitation. We've we have incubated the sample at 4 temperatures for up to 28 days. And we monitored the quality of the material by agarose gel, bioanalyzer, affinity analytical column, and an ion exchange hydrogen bonding analytical column to monitor degradation over time at various temperatures. What we demonstrated quite clearly was that for mRNA purified by affinity chromatography, so CIMmultus oligo DT, the stability of the mRNA did not change significantly over time. There was a very small amount of degradation observed at 37 degrees. A much larger amount of degradation, in fact significant degradation, occurred when mRNA was purified by precipitation, and this we demonstrated by analytical affinity chromatography. We demonstrated that by bioanalyzer, looking at fragmentation, and very clearly also by agarose gel electrophoresis, where we show that precipitated mRNA incubated at 37 degrees for 28 days was practically completely degraded, whereas its counterpart purified by affinity chromatography showed only very insignificant amount of degradation under the same incubation conditions. What we also demonstrated was that affinity analytical chromatography can be a good indicator of stability, whereas alternative methods, for example UV, but also this anion exchanging analytical chromatographic column, was not stability indicating in the same way. And to finish off on the same topic, we've then applied the same concept, so purification of mRNA, this time mRNA that was more than 3 times larger, so 4.4 thousand nucleotides long, purified by precipitation using a standard extraction kit, or by affinity chromatography with CIMmultus oligo DT, and we show the same effect, namely that at 2 weeks, sample purified by precipitation is completely degraded, whereas material purified by affinity chromatography is significantly more stable and shows band at target size by agarose gel, as well as by affinity chromatography CIMac oligo DT. I finish with this case study, and I thank you for your attention.